Chained on the rancher's land, the Apache girl kept her head bowed until the farm owner raised it. Before we dive into this tale, don't forget to hit that like button and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The wind swept steady across the yard, carrying dust that clung to the fence boards and stung the eyes if a man didn't lower his gaze. The land around Nahuel Ironhawk's ranch had been drying for months, each season harsher than the last. It was late autumn of 1882, and the earth cracked underfoot with the brittle sound of a land gone too long without rain. Nahuel had learned to keep his world small, mending fences, hauling water from the well, and keeping the stock alive just enough to push through winter. He rode into town only when forced to, and even then spoke only what was needed to settle accounts. That morning, his shoulders sore from splitting wood the day before he carried a bucket from the barn to the trough. His life had narrowed since the fever stole away Kiona Dawn and their little girl, Suni Little Bird, 3 winters ago. Now there was no grand plan, no dream beyond silence work, and enough food to make it through another day. That was his mission, nothing else. He didn't expect the day to change, but when he turned the corner of the yard and glanced toward the far fence line, his step faltered. At first he thought someone had tossed refuse there, some bundle of rags or an old coat snagged against the post. Then the shape moved, and the truth sank heavy in his chest. It wasn't rags, it was a woman. She had been shackled to his fence with a loop of iron wrists locked high against the post. Her head hung low, black hair spilling forward strands clotted with dust. Her dress was torn ripped open at the neckline and along the skirt. Beneath her bronze skin was marked with bruises, deep purple and yellow against dirt and sweat. Her chest rose shallow feet bare and cut raw where they pressed into the ground. Nahuel stopped a few paces off his jaw, tightening. He knew what this meant. Someone settlers or men from town had dragged her here and bound her like an animal on display. A warning or a cruel test. Either way, the moment he touched that chain, it became his burden. Deputies might ride out demanding answers. The people of Red River might call it harboring, and there was always the chance her own kin would come searching, and they would not forgive a man like him for standing over her. He stood rooted a long moment, weighing it all. He told himself to walk away, to go back inside, pick up the axe, and carry on with the chores. It would be simpler. No questions. No danger. His life was already narrowed to the smallest circle, and letting someone in meant tearing open wounds he'd sealed shut. But then he saw the irons bite on her wrists, the blood at her lip, the tremor in her shoulders each time she drew breath. She wasn't begging, wasn't even looking at him. Her chin stayed bowed, and the silence around her struck like a stone, dropped into a well. She wasn't broken, not yet, but close. Nahuel's heart beat heavy in his chest. It felt like the night he'd lost his family and could do nothing to stop it. That memory pressed down on him now. He could walk away, but he knew the image of her chained to his fence would haunt every night that followed. He'd carried enough ghosts. He could not add another. He set the bucket down. His hand went to the knife on his belt. The padlock was rusted cheap, already bent. He wedged the blade into the gap, forcing it until the metal snapped. The chain slackened, clattering against the post. The woman stumbled forward, arms dropping free. She caught herself against the wood, pulling her wrists close, rubbing at the red flesh where the iron had cut deep. Nahuel saw the marks, the dirt under her nails, the tremble in her knees as she tried to stand. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, though dirt and bruises masked her age. Her frame carried strength despite hunger, hips, full chest rising firm beneath torn cloth. Then for the first time, she lifted her face, Her eyes, dark watchful, met his. There was fear there, yes, but not pleading. She did not ask him for help. She only measured him cautious, weighing what kind of man he was. Nahuel's throat tightened. He wanted to ask her name, but the words stuck. Speech felt foreign after so much silence. Instead, he nodded toward the cabin. "Fire inside," he said, voice low and flat. She didn't move at first. He saw her weighing it the same way he'd weighed cutting her loose. She had no reason to trust him. Men had chained her, beaten her, stripped her dignity. For her, stepping into another man's cabin was its own kind of gamble. But the wind bit colder, and the raw wounds at her wrists spoke of hours without food or water. Slowly, deliberately, she shifted and took a step toward the cabin. Nahuel didn't reach for her. He walked ahead with the bucket, leaving her space to follow or not. His thoughts stayed sharp and steady. He would give her food, give her warmth, then decide what came next. He couldn't see beyond that. Survival was all he knew how to hold on to. Behind him, he heard the scrape of her bare feet against the dirt, hesitant, but moving all the same. The sound was small, yet it carried weight. The silence of his cabin would not be the same tonight. Behind him, Nahuel Ironhawk heard the scrape of bare feet dragging over the dirt, cautious, hesitant, but moving all the same. The sound carried heavier than it should have, because it meant the silence inside his cabin would no longer be his alone. He pushed the door open and stepped aside, letting the woman enter first. The cabin was plain built years ago when he had dreamed it would hold a family. One room, a stove in the corner, a narrow bed against the far wall, a table with 2 chairs. The shelves were thinly stocked with sacks of beans flour and dried corn. The air smelled of wood smoke and iron. Nahuel had kept it orderly not for comfort, but for habit. Now, as Ayana Moonshadow stepped across the threshold, he saw the sharp, wary way her eyes searched the room, like someone who had learned never to assume safety. She lingered near the door, hands tight against her body. Her dark hair hung loose over her shoulders, strands stuck to her face. She breathed hard, as if the short walk from the fence had drained what little she had left. Her legs quivered, though she forced herself upright. Nahuel set the bucket on the table, pulled a tin cup from the shelf, filled it halfway with water, and held it out. She hesitated, studying him, then reached with both hands. Her wrists were raw, the flesh swollen where the irons had dug in. She drank in slow gulps, not spilling a drop, then lifted the empty cup back toward him without a word. He refilled it, and this time she drank slower, letting the water steady her. Nahuel turned to the stove, the sun. The pot still held beans from the night before, thick and plain, but warm enough. He ladled some into a wooden bowl, set a piece of cornbread beside it, and placed both on the table. He didn't ask if she wanted it. She didn't sit right away, but the smell drew her closer. She lowered herself into the chair and gripped the spoon with unsteady fingers. She ate quickly at first, then slowed when she realized he was watching. Nahuel looked away, fussing with the stove door, though the scrape of spoon against bowl told him she had finished. When she was done, she folded her hands in her lap. Her shoulders loosened a little, though her eyes stayed alert, moving from him to the door, then to the single window facing the yard. Nahuel leaned back against the table, arms crossed, studying her in return. Questions pressed against him. Who had chained her there? Why his fence? Would someone come searching, but he kept them swallowed down. Words often did more harm than silence. His thoughts strayed to Kiona Dawn, the one who had once kept this cabin alive, who made it more than wood and nails. He remembered the quilt she stitched with uneven squares, wrapping their baby Sunni little bird the winter she was born. Fever had stolen both before spring, leaving him with only the quilt and a silence that had weighed ever since. Now, another woman sat in that same room. Her dress torn, her skin marked with bruises, the weight of it pressed against his chest like he was trespassing on his own grief. She shifted slightly, tugging at her torn neckline, and the movement caught his eyes before he could stop himself. Ashamed, he turned away quickly. Clearing his throat, he pulled down a cotton shirt from the shelf, soft with age, one that had belonged to Kiona Dawn years ago. He set it on the chair beside Ayana. "You can use that," he said, voice low. Her fingers brushed the fabric, slow and uncertain. Her gaze lifted, meeting his for the briefest breath. No words passed, only the faintest nod. She kept the shirt in her lap, not yet changing, but holding it eased something in her posture. Hours slipped into evening. Nahuel worked at the table mending tack, while Ayana sat near the fire. She did not speak, but her eyes followed his hands, patient, hardened by survival. When exhaustion pulled at her, her body sagged against the chair, eyelids heavy. Nahuel rose, uncertain. The bed was the only true place to sleep. He could take the floor. He gestured toward the bed. "You take it. I'll stay here." She didn't answer, only rose slowly, still clutching the shirt. She crossed the small room and laid herself down on the bed, not pulling the quilt over as if she wasn't sure she had the right. Nahuel turned the fire higher and spread his own blanket across the floorboards. He lay with his back to the room, eyes on the orange glow of the stove. Sleep came slow. His mind circled the same questions. Would men return for her? Would Dakota Greywolf ride out with papers from Matto Strongbear? And what if her people came instead, seeing her inside his cabin? Every answer carried danger. But then he remembered the bite of the iron at her wrists, her bowed chin, the pride still burning in her eyes. Leaving her would have been easier, yes, but it would have hollowed him out in a way he could no longer endure. Nahuel Ironhawk turned slightly, eyes drawn to the bed. Ayana Moonshadow lay curled on her side, her breathing steady at last. The torn dress still clung to her battered frame, but her hands were wrapped tight around the cotton shirt he had given her, holding it close against her chest, as though it were the first safe thing she had touched in days. Nahuel let out a long breath and turned back to the fire. The silence inside the cabin had changed. For the first time since he laid Kiona Dawn and little Sunni little bird in the ground, it felt like someone else was carrying that silence with him. Morning broke pale through the cracks in the shutters, a narrow beam of light spilling across the cabin floor. Nahuel had barely slept, his body restless on the hard boards by the stove. He rose stiff, pulled on his boots, and reached for his coat. When he turned, he found Ayana still on the bed, her dark hair loose across the quilt, her face calmer than it had been the night before. She was younger than he had thought when he first saw her chained to his fence, maybe 24, though bruises marked her skin. She clutched the shirt to her chest, as if it were armor. For the first time since stepping into his cabin, she looked almost at peace. Quietly, Nahuel stoked the fire. The crackle of wood snapped her awake. She blinked, sat up slowly, and pulled the shirt over her head. It hung loose, but cinched at the waist. It looked decent, far better than the torn rags she'd worn the day before. When she stood, her balance was steadier. Her gaze swept the cabin, the shelves, the tools, the bucket by the door. Her eyes lingered on him, a moment sharper, now less fearful, more curious. Nahuel busied himself with the morning chores. He poured her another cup of water, then set beans and bread on the table. This time she ate slower, pausing between spoonfuls, her shoulders less tense. He studied her as he ate his own portion, and when her bowl was empty, she set it aside neatly, as though waiting for permission. Then, without a word, she rose, lifted the bucket, and stepped barefoot outside. Nahuel followed her with his eyes as she crossed the yard toward the well. Her steps were cautious at first, but once she reached the rope and pulley, her hands moved with practiced certainty. She drew water without spilling a drop, carried the bucket back, and placed it by the stove. It was the first sign she meant to bear her share. Nahuel said nothing, but the tightness in his chest loosened. He had feared she might sit silent and broken, waiting for him to keep her alive. Instead, she showed she could stand work and survive beside him. Still, questions gnawed at him. Who had chained her to his fence? Why his land? Was it punishment, a warning, or both? Did she have kin searching for her? The borderlands had grown restless settlers, pushing deeper tribes, scattered and driven, and Dakota Greywolf eager for excuses to show power on behalf of Mato Strong Bear. He could not be sure which side had marked her. That afternoon, Nahuel worked the fence where the boards had sagged. Ayana followed without being told, carrying a hammer and a pouch of nails. He watched her from the corner of his eye as she held the boards steady while he drove them in. Her hands were small, but strong, her grip firm despite bruises. She said nothing, but each time he nodded to another post, she moved there without hesitation. By evening, the fence stood straighter than it had in weeks. Nahuel's back ached, but there was quiet satisfaction, too. He had not worked alongside another soul in years, not since fever took Kiona and Suni. Now, for the first time, his breath was not the only one in rhythm with the work. He glanced at her, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. No words were spoken, but something passed between them, surviving together, not apart. Inside, she moved to the chest, where Kiona's old quilts were folded. She touched the fabric, but left it undisturbed, a kind of respect Nahuel hadn't expected. Instead, she busied herself sweeping dust out with a bundle of dry grass she had gathered earlier. It was clumsy, but the meaning was clear. She wanted to contribute, not remain a burden. That night after supper, Nahuel sat at the table mending tack while she sat by the fire. The cotton shirt, now cinched with a strip torn from her ruined dress, fit closer to her waist, shaping her hips and frame. He caught himself looking too long, then forced his eyes back to the leather strap in his hands. He reminded himself she was here because he had refused to let her die, nothing more. Yet he could not deny he noticed the strength she carried even through the scars. When it grew late, he laid his blanket on the floor as before. She hesitated at the bed this time, her eyes flicking toward him. For a moment it looked as though Ayana Moonshadow might offer the bed back, but Nahuel Ironhawk shook his head. Years now, he said simply, his voice leaving no room for argument. She lay down, pulling the quilt over herself this time, and for the first time since she had arrived, she closed her eyes without clutching the shirt in her hands. Nahuel sat awake a while longer, staring at the fire. The silence in the cabin had shifted. It was no longer the crushing weight of grief pressing on him alone. Now it was a shared silence, one that carried the sound of another's breath, the scrape of bare feet across the floor, the faint rustle of cloth as she settled into the bed. He still did not know her name, nor if she would ever trust him enough to give it. He didn't know if men would come pounding on his door with questions. But for now, she was inside his walls, alive, and working beside him. Nahuel leaned back and shut his eyes. The mission he had carried since losing Kiona Dawn and little Suni Little Bird, survive alone, speak little, keep the cabin standing, had shifted. Now it was survival for two. He didn't yet know if he had the strength, but the choice was already made. The days began to settle into a rhythm, though not the kind Nahuel had known before. For years his mornings had been marked only by his own boots across the dirt, his own breath in the stillness. Now there was another presence laid over his. When he came back from the barn, he found Ayana awake, seated by the stove, the shirt cinched at her waist, her hair brushed back with her fingers. She kept the place neat, sweeping dust with a bundle of dried grass, fashioned into a broom, folding the quilt square at the bed's end once she rose. Her presence was no longer the shock it had been that first morning. But every time Nahuel saw her moving through the cabin, the reminder struck him he was no longer alone. His thoughts kept circling the torn dress she had worn when she arrived. It still hung over the back of a chair, ripped low at the neckline and frayed along the seams. Each glance at it twisted something in his gut. It was indecent to keep her in rags, yet all he had left were the clothes belonging to Kiona. He hesitated every time he opened the chest at the foot of the bed where her garments were folded untouched since fever took her. But one evening when the wind turned sharp and cold, he made the choice. He laid a faded cotton dress on the table. It was plain stitched years ago by Kiona's hands. He placed it carefully as though setting down a memory. Ayana's eyes moved from the dress to him. Nahuel cleared his throat. "You can wear that. It's better than what you have." She touched the fabric, running her fingertips along the seams. Her hands paused at the uneven stitches, the kind only a woman's hand in a lonely cabin could make. She lifted her gaze, holding his longer than before. There was no smile, but recognition. She knew the weight of what it cost him to place that dress before her. Rising, she carried it behind the stove, slipped out of the shirt, and into the dress. Nahuel kept his eyes lowered, focusing on the leather strap he was mending, though he couldn't help but catch the sound of fabric following the rustle of her adjusting. When she stepped out, the dress brushed her ankles loose, but decent. She cinched it with the same strip of cloth she had used before. The bruises on her arms stood out against the pale fabric, but her figure was strong hips, full chest, rising firm. Nahuel forced himself to glance only once, then returned to his work. He had given her a piece of his past, and in doing so, she had become part of his present. It was a shift he wasn't ready to name. That night after supper, he tried something he hadn't done in years. He spoke more than a few words. She had given no name, only silence, but he needed to ask. "You got a name?" His voice was low. Ayana studied him across the table. Her lips parted, then closed again. Finally, she whispered one word, soft, carrying the accent of her people. "Ayana." Nahuel nodded once. He didn't repeat it aloud, but the sound of it settled into him. Ayana. His chest tightened from hearing her voice at last. It had been too long since another name lingered inside his cabin. From that evening forward, she began to use his tools and space as if testing what might belong to her. She fetched water without being told, stacked wood along the wall, even patched one of his shirts with clumsy stitches. Small acts, but more than survival, they were pieces of dignity returned. Nahuel's thoughts circled her. The way the cotton dress shaped her, the sound of her quiet steps across the floorboards, the look in her eyes when she measured him without fear. Attraction pressed against his grief and guilt followed behind. Every corner of the cabin still held Kiona's memory, and yet here he was, feeling his chest tighten at the sight of another woman. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to steady his breath. This wasn't a choice he had made. It had been thrust upon him. All he had done was refuse to let her die. One morning, when frost clung to the trough, Nahuel found Ayana outside gathering kindling near the barn. She lifted her face, breath white in the cold air, and for the first time since she had come, Fear was gone from her eyes. Ayana Moonshadow stood tall, her braid falling down her back, her hand steady on the bundle of sticks. Nahuel Ironhawk stopped for a moment, struck by the sight. She looked like she belonged in that yard, working alongside him. The thought cut deeper than he expected. That evening they ate in silence, as always, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the quiet of two people who understood the weight of the day without needing words. When she reached for the water cup, her fingers brushed his. Neither pulled back. The touch was brief, but it sent a charge through him he hadn't felt in years. She looked at him, her dark eyes steady, and for the first time he held her gaze without turning away. Something unspoken passed between them. No love, yet no trust, but a step toward both. Nahuel finished his meal, pushed back his chair, and forced his voice steady. "We'll need to mend more of the fence tomorrow," he said. She nodded once, simple and sure. That night, as he lay by the fire with his blanket, he closed his eyes knowing tomorrow would not be the same as yesterday. The cabin no longer felt like a place to endure. With Ayana inside it, it felt alive again. Winter's grip deepened. The cold slipped through the cracks of the cabin walls, sinking into his bones long after the fire dimmed. Nahuel had learned to endure it, sleeping alone by the stove for years, telling himself one blanket was enough. But now the cabin held two, and the silence was no longer his alone. That night he lay on the floorboards, back to the fire, staring at the rough planks. The sound of Ayana shifting on the bed carried through the stillness. She had pulled the quilt high, but he could hear the catch in her breath, the tremor each time the wind pressed against the walls. The fire's glow was weak, not enough to chase the chill from the corners. Nahuel told himself to let it be. She had food warmth abed, more than what she'd been given before. That should have been enough. Minutes passed. Then came the smallest sound, the whisper of bare feet on the boards. Nahuel opened his eyes and saw her standing near the fire blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair falling loose across her face. Her feet were pale against the floor. She didn't speak. She only looked at him steady but uncertain, as if waiting to be told to return to the bed. Nahuel pushed himself up on one elbow. "You cold?" he said, more statement than question. She gave the faintest nod. He motioned to the space by the fire. "Sit. The heat's better here." She lowered herself slowly, settling close enough that the blanket brushed against his arm. The warmth of her body carried faintly through the fabric. Nahuel clenched his jaw, forcing himself still. He hadn't sat this near to another soul in years, and the weight of it stirred something raw inside him. For a while they stayed silent, the only sound the pop of burning wood. Ayana held the blanket tighter across her chest, her eyes fixed on the flames. Nahuel kept his gaze forward, though his thoughts wandered. He remembered nights when Kiona Dawn had sat by this fire, humming to Suni Little Bird as she rocked her to sleep. That life was buried in the ground behind the cottonwoods. Yet here was another woman shaping the silence in a new way. Guilt pressed against his ribs, heavy and sharp. Then her hand shifted beneath the blanket, brushing against his. The touch was light, hesitant, like a question. Nahuel didn't move away. His pulse quickened, but he steadied his breath, waiting. She didn't pull back. Instead, her fingers rested lightly against his, not grasping, not demanding, just there. He turned his head slightly, watching her. Her eyes stayed on the fire, but the tension had eased from her shoulders. She was no longer trembling. He understood then it wasn't desire. It wasn't hunger for something more. It was about safety, about not being alone in the dark. He let his hand remain the quiet contact carrying more weight than words. After a long while, she leaned against him, her shoulder pressing into his arm. Nahuel stiffened at first, memories of loss burning through him, but slowly he shifted just enough to steady her. Her head came to rest against his shoulder, hair brushing his jaw. She sighed softly, her body easing for the first time since he had found her in chains. The fire crackled low. Nahuel reached with his free hand, placed another log on the coals, and the flames rose higher, throwing brighter light across the cabin walls. In that glow, he saw Ayana's face turn slightly toward him, calm now, the lines of fear smoothed away. She still clutched the blanket to her chest, but the grip of survival had softened into something gentler. Nahuel's thoughts turned heavy again. He knew the risk of this bond. If the Dan Lang Red River discovered she was here, they would call it theft, maybe worse. If her people came, they might see him as another captor. Yet none of that mattered in the stillness of that moment. What mattered now was the weight of Ayana Moonshadow's head against his shoulder, the trust she had placed in him by closing her eyes so near. When her breathing slowed, he knew she had fallen asleep. Nahuel stayed still, not daring to move, letting her rest. His hand remained beneath hers, his shoulder steady under her weight. For the first time in years, Nahuel Ironhawk did not feel the silence pressing him into the earth. Instead, it felt shared, something alive. When the fire burned low, he carefully leaned, guiding her back toward the bed. She stirred, opened her eyes faintly, then let him settle her beneath the quilt. Her hand lingered on his for a moment longer, before she turned onto her side. Nahuel stepped back, laying down once more by the stove. The night stretched long, but the cold didn't bite as sharply. He closed his eyes, carrying with him the memory of her head on his shoulder, and sleep came easier than it had in years. At dawn, he woke earlier than usual. The fire had burned down to embers, the air sharp against his face. Rolling onto his side, he expected only the pop of wood, but another sound reached him. Soft movement near the stove. Ayana crouched low, feeding small sticks into the coals. Her hair tumbled loose over her shoulders, the cotton dress cinched at the waist with a strip of fabric. She glanced up when she felt his stare, then returned her focus to the flames. Nahuel stretched stiff joints. "Didn't have to do that," he said. Ayana's lips parted as if she wanted to reply, but instead she gave the smallest nod. It was the first time she had acted without waiting for him to lead, and the simple act struck him more than he cared to admit. After breakfast, they worked outside. Nahuel replaced a corral rail where frost had loosened the post, and Ayana carried tools holding wood steady as he hammered. They spoke little, but the silence wasn't heavy anymore. When his hand brushed hers as he reached for the hammer, she didn't flinch as she would have days before. Instead, she stood firm, watching him with steady eyes. By evening, the light dimmed, early winter pressing close. The cabin filled with the smell of beans simmering on the stove. Ayana sat at the table, sewing with a needle and thread she had found in the chest. Her stitches were crooked, but they held. Nahuel worked across from her, patching leather. From time to time, their eyes met across the table, each glance lasting longer than the one before. The weight of it pressed on him. Attraction, guilt, memory. He had buried Kiona Dawn and Suni Little Bird with his own hands. For years, no one had crossed his threshold, let alone sat close enough for him to notice the rise of her chest each time she drew breath. He hated himself for noticing, yet he couldn't stop. After supper, Ayana cleared the bowls and set them neatly on the shelf. She moved with quiet steadiness, no longer trembling as she had that first night. Nahuel leaned back, watching her, wondering how much she trusted him now. Enough to stay, enough to rest. But would she trust him enough to let him closer? When the fire sank low, Ayana pulled a chair nearer the hearth. Nahuel joined her, holding his hands out toward the flames. They sat side by side, the light flickering across their faces. She leaned forward, her braid slipping across her shoulder, and his hand brushed hers on the chair's arm. This time, instead of pulling away, she turned her palm so it rested lightly against his. His throat tightened. He wanted to draw back, give her space, but her hand stayed steady, warm against his. He looked at her, then really looked. Her eyes were dark and clear, filled with something he hadn't seen in years. Slowly, carefully, Nahuel reached across and touched her cheek. His hand trembled with the weight of the choice, but she didn't move away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly into his palm, the warmth of her skin grounding him in the moment. The cabin fell into a hush, save for the crackle of fire. Nahuel leaned closer, pausing just short, waiting. Ayana met him halfway, her lips brushing his. The kiss was soft, hesitant, but real. His chest tightened, every muscle taut with restraint. He didn't push, didn't take more than she gave. When they parted, her breath lingered close, her eyes steady on his. He lowered his hand, his voice rough. "You don't have to." The words faltered. Ayana shook her head once. Slow, deliberate. The meaning was clear. She had chosen. They sat together in the glow of the fire, and the silence carried warmth instead of loneliness. Nahuel felt his grief stir inside him, but for the first time in years, it wasn't all he carried. Something new had taken root, fragile, but alive. When Ayana finally rose to lay down on the bed, Nahuel stayed by the fire, stretched out under his blanket, eyes fixed on the flames. His lips still burned from the touch of hers, his heartbeat unsteady in his chest. Nahuel Ironhawk knew the road ahead would be hard town gossip deputies, maybe worse. But in the stillness of that night, none of it mattered. What mattered was the choice she had made, and the one he had allowed himself. For the first time since burying Kiona Dawn and little Suni, little bird, Nahuel closed his eyes with the weight of another soul, not only inside his cabin, but inside the silence he had carried for years. The week after that kiss passed in a quiet rhythm, but Nahuel knew it couldn't last. Word traveled quick among the Dan Lang Red River, and someone would notice the Apache girl chained to his fence was no longer there. He rode into town only once to buy nails and lamp oil. As he walked the dirt street, he felt the stares. Men leaned against the rail outside the saloon, spitting tobacco, narrowing their eyes as he passed. He didn't speak, didn't linger. He finished his trade and rode out, jaw tight. Back at the cabin, Ayana Moonshadow sensed the shift in him. She said little, but her eyes followed him closer, now pausing when he came in from the barn, searching his face when he sat heavy at the table. She had spoken her name once, and though her words were still scarce, her silence carried more weight now. She moved through the cabin with purpose, as though she had claimed it for her own. Nahuel noticed the way she kept the stove warm, the way she mended his shirts, the way she stacked wood neatly against the wall. Each act bound her deeper to this place and to him. On the 8th morning, a rider came. Nahuel was outside repairing the trough when he heard the crunch of hooves on frozen ground. He stiffened. Dakota Greywolf. One of the younger deputies rode up, slow, hat pulled low against the wind. He reined his horse near the yard and spat into the dirt. "Heard you've been keeping company out here." "Ironhawk?" Dakota said, his voice casual but edged. "Funny thing, a girl goes missing from where folks left her, and now you're buying more food than usual." Nahuel straightened, setting the hammer down on the trough. His face was calm, though his shoulders tightened. "Anyone under my roof," he said evenly, "is mine to protect. That's the end of it." Dakota leaned forward in his saddle eyes, sliding toward the cabin door. "You know Maddo Strongbear signed papers. Strays get rounded up, debts settled. Folks paying for their labor. You're turning this into your problem." Behind the cabin door, Ayana pressed her hand against the frame, listening. Fear gripped her chest. The same fear as when the chain bit into her wrists while men laughed at her shame. But then she heard Nahuel's voice again, steady flat a wall between her and the world outside. "This cabin is mine," Nahuel said, his voice sharp as iron. "And anyone inside it is mine to protect. Don't ride out here again unless you've got business worth speaking." Dakota's smirk faded. The silence stretched. Nahuel didn't move, didn't explain. Didn't. He just stood there, until the deputy muttered under his breath, tugged the reins, and turned his horse. Hooves crunched back down the trail, until the sound faded. Nahuel exhaled slowly, heavy in his chest. He turned to find Ayana standing in the doorway, eyes wide but steady. For a long moment, they only looked at each other. "You stay," Nahuel said, his voice rough now. "No one's taking you." She stepped onto the porch, her bare feet careful on the wood, and came toward him. The cold bit sharp, but she didn't flinch. She stopped close enough for him to see the red marks on her wrists beginning to heal. Slowly, she raised her hand and placed it against his chest, right over his heart. Her eyes searched his, and though no words passed, her meaning was clear. She trusted him. That night, the silence inside the cabin carried a different weight. Nahuel sat at the table, staring at a paper nailed to the wall, a bill of sale for cattle he had signed months back. It struck him how paper carried more power in this land than flesh and blood. Men thought they could own others with ink and seal. He looked at Ayana by the fire, her face calm in the glow, and clenched his jaw. Not this time. Not her. After a while, she rose and placed a mended shirt on the table, folded neat. She touched his arm lightly before stepping back. He caught her hand before she could pull away. For a moment, they stood close, the fire painting their shadows long against the wall. Nahuel lifted her hand to his lips and pressed it there, not hurried, not forceful, just steady. Her breath caught her shoulders, stiffened. It was the first time he had kissed anything but her lips, and the gesture carried more than words could. She squeezed his hand in return, eyes soft. For the first time since she entered his cabin, Nahuel felt certainty settle inside him. He had chosen, and he would not turn back. The night grew colder, but the fire held. When they lay down, she in the bed, he on the floor, the silence between them was no longer the silence of survival. It was the silence of two people bracing against the world together. Dakota Greywolf never returned, though. Nahuel Ironhawk knew the matter wasn't finished. Whispers among the Dan Lang Red River would spread, but for now the cabin stood quiet. The days fell into a rhythm more natural than Nahuel expected, as if the land itself had bent to the new balance. Ayana Moonshadow rose early, often before him, tending the stove and warming water. When Nahuel stepped into the yard, he'd find her stacking wood, her braid neat, her movements steady. She carried herself differently now, not like someone waiting to be broken, but like someone laying claim to her place. Nahuel noticed. She moved through the cabin without hesitation, reaching for tools, setting, meals, sweeping dust, never pausing at the door as though she were uncertain. She simply belonged, as though the cabin had always been hers. They worked side by side on the fence, hauling boards carrying water-tending stock. When Ayana lifted more than her frame could manage, Nahuel took half the weight without a word. She didn't resist, didn't stiffen, only nodded once, accepting the partnership. At night, they sat near the fire. Sometimes Ayana hummed so soft Nahuel had to lean forward to catch it. It reminded him of evenings long gone when Kiona Dawn sang to Suni Little Bird. At first, the memory struck sharp guilt pressing against him, but with time, it eased. He began to see that remembering didn't mean turning away from what was before him now. The closeness grew in small steps. After their kiss, Nahuel had braced for distance. Maybe regret, but Ayana never pulled back. When their hands brushed, she let them linger. When his hand touched her shoulder after supper, she leaned into it. Each gesture was careful chosen, but heavy with meaning. One evening, after a day hauling heavy boards, Nahuel returned to the cabin with his arms-sore shirt damp from sweat. He found Ayana at the table setting out 2 bowls. She looked up, and for the first time she smiled. Not wide, not long, but enough to change her face completely. The sight caught him off guard. He stood still, an ache sharp in his chest. He realized how rare joy was on her features, how much had been stolen before. That night by the fire, the silence shifted again. Nahuel leaned back, half his eyes closed, when he felt her hand brush his. This time she didn't hesitate. She took his hand in hers, holding steady, her thumb brushing across his scarred knuckles. He turned to her, and when she met his gaze, there was no fear in her eyes. Only trust, and something deeper stirring inside him. He leaned toward her slow, and she met him halfway. The kiss was firmer this time, no longer tentative. Her hand rested against his chest, steadying herself, while his arms circled her back, drawing her closer. For a long moment they stayed that way, firelight flickering across their faces. 2 people who had carried grief and humiliation, now choosing something different. When they parted, Nahuel rested his forehead against hers. "You're safe here," he said softly. Ayana closed her eyes, her breath warm against him. She didn't answer with words, but the way she pressed closer was answer enough. The next days carried the same rhythm: work, silence, shared meals, small touches that no longer felt uncertain. Nahuel began to hear the cabin differently. 2 bowls on the table, 2 sets of footsteps on the floorboards, 2 breaths in the night. The space no longer felt hollow. It felt lived in. He thought often of Kiona and Suni. At first, the memories struck like wounds, but slowly, he saw they no longer barred him from living. They were his past. Ayana was his present. He didn't forget, but he breathed easier. He saw the same change in her. The fear that shadowed her eyes when he found her in chains had faded. She carried herself with dignity, now her back straight, her chin lifted. One evening, as the wind rattled the shutters, Nahuel sat by the fire, while Ayana mended one of his shirts. She looked up, caught him watching. This time he didn't look away. She set the needle aside and crossed the small room. Placing the shirt down, she laid a hand on his shoulder. Nahuel turned, and she lowered herself onto his lap, her eyes steady. For a moment he froze, torn between restraint and the ache burning inside him. But when she leaned in, he met her kissing her deeply, his hands firm against her back. The fire burned low, the cabin warm with more than heat. When they parted, Ayana rested her head against his chest. Her body relaxed, her breathing even. Nahuel Ironhawk held her close, his eyes shutting as the weight of years of silence eased. In that moment, he understood she wasn't a guest, wasn't a burden, wasn't something the world had left chained to his fence. She was his choice, and he was hers. When the cold swept hard across the borderlands, frost glazed the troughs, and the ground stiffened under the weight of winter. Each morning, Nahuel woke to the soft glow of the stove and the sound of Ayana Moonshadow moving near it. She had woven herself into his days so completely he could no longer picture the silence without her. 2 bowls sat on the table at every meal. 2 sets of hands worked the fences. 2 voices, one quiet, one steadier, moved through the long hours. Dakota Greywolf never came back, but Nahuel knew the whispering hadn't ended. On trips into town for flour and nails, men stared at him spitting tobacco into the dirt as he passed. But none pushed further. Word had spread about the way he'd stood at his door flat-eyed and unyielding, making it clear anyone under his roof was his to protect. The Dan Lang Red River might gossip, but they wouldn't test him. Ayana knew the risk, too. Some nights her eyes flicked to the door, when the wind rattled it, her body tensing, until she saw it was only weather. Nahuel spoke more than steady words to match his actions. "No one's taking you," he told her more than once. And each time her hand found his and his shoulders eased. The work grew heavier as snow pressed down. Nahuel had planned to face the season alone, but now he had her beside him. She mended seams in his shirt's patched feed sacks, stacked wood high along the wall. Sometimes he caught her humming soft songs in her own tongue. He didn't know the words, but the sound carried peace. When he asked, she told him song for work, song for staying. He nodded. The meaning was clear. As the days shortened, their bond grew stronger. At night, she came to sit beside him, without hesitation, leaning against his arm, or resting her head on his chest. Nahuel grew used to the weight of her in his lap, the warmth of her breath against his neck. Their kisses grew more certain, slow, deliberate, carrying the choice they both had made. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't desperation. It was trust, built in silence and steady gestures. One evening, as snow fell soft against the roof, Nahuel tacked a paper to the wall. Not a bill of sale, but the deed to the cabin and land signed in his name years ago. He had never cared to look at it before, but now he wanted it plain to see. Ayana set down the quilt she was stitching and studied the paper, then looked at him. He stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "This is ours now," he said firmly. "Yours and mine." Her eyes softened. She reached for his hand and pressed it over her heart. "Stay," she whispered. "I'll stay," Nahuel answered. From that night on, they lived as though the question had been settled. She was no longer someone he had taken in. She was his partner. When neighbors rode past and cast long looks, Nahuel didn't lower his gaze. He walked beside her, letting the sight speak its own truth. She was his, and he was hers. The cabin itself bore her hand. She hung little pouches of herbs near the stove, their scent mingling with wood smoke. She laid a woven strip of cloth she had stitched across the table, plain but bright with color. For the first time in years, the cabin felt like a home. On the coldest night of winter, with snow piled high against the door and wind cutting sharp outside, Nahuel sat by the fire, with Ayana nestled against him. Her head rested over his heart, her hand steady on his chest. His mind went to the graves beneath the cottonwoods, to the years of solitude, to the silence he had endured. The grief remained, but it no longer hollowed him. It lived beside something new. Warmth, trust, the sense of family returned. He pressed his lips to hers and spoke the truth, steady and final. "You're my family now, Ayana lifted her face, her eyes bright in the firelight. For the first time she smiled without hesitation, without fear. She kissed him slow and certain, sealing what both already knew. Outside, the snow covered the earth in silence. Inside, the cabin held two people once broken and cast aside, now bound not by chains or grief, but by choice. Nahuel Ironhawk was no longer alone. Ayana Moonshadow was no longer a prisoner. They were a family, one they had chosen, and they would remain so for the rest of their days. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.